Hello, and welcome to the Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larsson.
Kai, thank you very much for joining me today on the Grow Places podcast, episode 50. So I'm really honoured to have you on for this special episode.
Thank you, Tom, and congratulations on reaching 50.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think the average is 1 to 2 episodes for most podcasts last before they give up. But so yeah, we've really stuck at it. But we're really enjoying it and getting a huge amount from it, and I'm sure everyone will get a huge amount from this conversation as well. So I'll let you introduce yourself in a second, but just in order to frame that, that we're sat here in Big's London studio, fascinating array of projects surrounding us, and it'd be great to also hear about kind of what you think maybe ties those projects together from your personal perspective and also from the businesses when you introduce yourself.
Sure. So, we have been physically, or let's say have the office since 2000 and around 14, I think is when so 11 years old. And it, of course, it was given birth by actually working on the Google King's Cross project. And so it was maybe, never considered or to be thought of as an office. We were actually located next to the project in a project office where BDP, Heatherwick, and ourselves were all working. And then over the course of like the next 2 years where the project took shape in King's Cross, we ended up getting the Serpentine Pavilion. And that was 2016. So now almost a decade ago. And that was I would say the seed in many ways. And it should be said that that when you get the Serpentine as a foreign architect, you are not to have a built project in all of the UK. So, I don't know if that was the decision making that happened in order for us to pick it up, but it certainly was this moment for Big to reflect on being here. And by that time, we did pick up a couple of other projects. And now, all this time later, we have about 200 people working here in the London office. So it really is, I think, a very firm footing of Bjarke Ingels Group globally. And it enriches our other practices because the types of projects are very, very different that we have here.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And I remember going to the Serpentine well, and to that point of kind of your overarching design sort of thesis, I've always thought that was quite a pure example in some senses of the kind of the initial big kind of principle of modularity and form and other things. So would you say that that's fair in terms of your?
Yes, I think it's both simple, diagrammatic, but also complex. And I think that is very much at the core of many projects. So Bjarke said at the time, it's a wall that turns into a hall. And that way of sort of unzipping those prefab elements. And then again, it's like a prefab element fiber line that had not yet really found its full kind of like potential. And so we used the project as well to kind of show its structural capabilities by creating a brick that was not the brick, it was the frame, and then pulling that frame apart. So it's investigative about a material. It's trying to do something structurally that's quite kind of ambitious, and then it's like still making a reference to sort of all the beautiful brick architecture that is around with the old Serpentine Hall there as well. So I do think it actually encapsulates a lot of different things.
Yeah, amazing. And you've touched on there the approach to whether like Serpentine brick or other things about sort of local sort of references as well as the kind of core concepts to that project, which I think are fascinating. And us as a thoughtful regeneration company at Grow Places, we try to promote this idea of place growth and this idea that places can change, develop, and they should, and that should be both aspirational and optimistic, but it should be done in a way that is local and is contextual and is rooted in the place, and so that places and developments have that sort of authenticity to the neighborhood and the people who are there. And so it's something I've always admired actually about the work that you guys do. Clearly you are an international business, but with projects in different places all over the world, but there does feel like a consistency of hand, but also there feels like a kind of rooting of those projects. And I don't know if you wanted to kind of add anything to that, or do you agree with that?
Well, I think Bjarke, when he set off from OMA, he was working on a library in Seattle, Washington. And Seattle is a place that I was living when REM came in and started or wanted to create a kind of central library, which would have become and is one of the biggest public amenities in the city. And what is hugely unique about Seattle was just that it's the place that has the highest book readership in the United States. It has, Amazon. It started as a bookstore, and it is because of the population there. And so you took something that was so local and very qualitative to the people. And when Bjarke started, setting up his own idea of what, he wanted to do, I think the way that we start a project is by immersing ourselves into that location to really understand that culture. And in the same way that I feel OMA is highly pragmatic and highly, academic in certain aspects of its research, and that they become drivers within the concept, that translated over to our process. And so we really do dig in, and maybe a project of today that emulates this is Bhutan, where, we've now worked for close to 3 years, very, very immersive. There are so many trips that the teams are taking and living there. We've even committed to opening an office there, working with the local community. And I think it's that commitment that then translates into the concepts that we produce.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the Bhutan example, because Christian Rees was a previous guest of mine on the podcast.
Yes.
Christian.
Volcano.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And his whole kind of ethos and business really is around that, isn't it? It's kind of sort of, how do you use means that aren't architectural? In his case, it's kind of music and culture as a way to kind of understand people and networks, and how can that enrich briefs and projects. And so, yeah, he on this podcast talked a little bit about that.
I see a lot of parallels actually with Grow Places.
Yeah.
I don't know if you would.
Yeah. Well, we've known each other well. I wasn't a rock star by background. That's my only difference between myself and him. But yeah, for us, we're really like interested in that kind of brief aspect, like kind of,
Yes.
if you're saying all in the wrong questions, then
No, but it all starts with the brief.
Yeah.
And you can, when you think back on your best projects, right, it goes back to the best briefs, which again goes back to maybe the best clients that are preparing those briefs. For clarity's sake, for like minutia's sake, but I do think that that's a major kind of piece of success in a project.
Mm. And then how do you see that? Because sometimes a brief will have a lot of kind of vision in it. It'll be quite aspirational, but other times you may look at a brief and think, okay, well, there's a kind of there's more we can do here. And I think the role of the architect is to kind of to do that, and to positively test the brief and other things. And I think about, the work that you've done at, obviously the obvious examples maybe CopenHill, or it's like, the work that you've done in New York with the dry line, or other things where you're really probably, I would imagine, sort of testing that brief and working with that to see, okay, well, how can we sort of make more of this project for people or for place than the kind of the nature of the brief may suggest.
Yeah, Bjarke has in the past often likened the architect and what we do, the role that we play as a midwife,
Right.
and that we're helping basically the process of birthing the idea or birthing the very essence of a project. And so actually CopenHill is a really great example of that, because in that, the brief stated that there are energy plants. Energy plants are typically ugly and utilitarian. They're also shielded and off limits. And the brief stated, let us create the most beautiful power plant that is an amenity to the city. And that can be interpreted in many, many different ways. But what we understood that to mean is, how can you take something that is typically, billions of pounds or, hundreds of millions of pounds of investment to get built everywhere. We use them every single day. We're dependent on them, and allow them to reveal themselves and provide more service. So that same investment could also become an educational tool for kids, in schools, to go and tour and learn about waste to energy, and perhaps to make less waste. Because ideally, where we should go as a society is to put that waste to energy plant out of business. If we can create a circular kind of future, then there is no waste to incinerate, right? We would rather have recycling plants. And that's also the future, I think, that we saw. This was like a stepping stone to reach that future. But this plant, the CopenHill that you're referring to, is allowing Copenhagen to actually become one of the first net zero cities on the planet. Because again, it's finding ways to create energy through renewable resources, not fossil fuels. And so how we interpreted that brief was, how can we not only wrap the the innards and the inner workings of a power plant with a beautiful facade. It was, how can that facade help facilitate and give something back, a gift to the community? And that became the ski slope and the climbing wall and the praise ski bar that's up on top. So no matter if you ski or you climb or you just love drinking, this is a place for you to go. And I think that's opened Copenhageners' minds as to what else could be an amenity for the city.
Mm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I listened to Bjarke talk about it once before, and it was almost in one sense was a very kind of simple idea, was that Danes love to ski and there's nowhere to ski in Copenhagen.
Yeah.
So again, another thing I observed from your work is that there are often quite big ideas, quite kind of easy to understand human ideas that you don't have to be a developer or a built environment professional to kind of learn the nuances of. And then there's the kind of layers within that, isn't there, about like some of the stuff you just described there. So maybe I'd be really curious in terms of your process, like how do you see that kind of on a project when it comes forward, like that sort of that big idea with kind of the layers to that?
Yeah. So it is maybe an iterative process. It doesn't just come clearly onto your desk and this is it. I think you have to really work through, and that's where the hours are spent. But in the case of CopenHill, what's interesting is that Danes do love to ski. And because of that, they have a ski federation. And the ski federation is always organizing trips to either northern Sweden or to the Swiss Alps. Now imagine that you're sort of filling busloads of skiers in Copenhagen, driving 8 to 12 hours, going skiing for a couple of days, and then driving that same way back. And if you would do the energy calculation, right, the CO2 calculation of just taking those folks who love to ski into these like faraway places, it really doesn't make sense. And if you could actually provide a place of recreation and of, providing a place where you can get that out of your system and you enjoy doing it, you've just cut that entire sort of travel distance. You've actually raised the quality of life for, a group of people. And I think that is a driver. And so when you start looking at what can a project give, how could it actually raise the quality of life for its inhabitants, users, for neighbors, that is what drives, I think, a lot of the decision making. And I'll use one other example, the VIA project in New York, which is this pyramid-shaped building where the client was building in front of one of their other towers that they had built previously. And every concept that they had seen was taking the views away from the previous tower. They had not yet come up with a scheme that would preserve the views. So if we then looked at that scheme and we were looking and considering 2 or 3 towers, and it was very hard to position them in any sort of way. But when we came up with the shape and we pushed the development over to the side and it grew from a base, the quartz scraper, to a point, we managed to get the same density and FAR, but we preserved like 75-80% of the views from the building behind. That raises the quality of life for those folks, and it maintains the value of that development from 5 years before. So that again is the generation of that concept did not happen the first week. It happened several weeks later, and we had to go through that process to get there.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of notion of value in its broader sense, and how you can tell stories really for different audiences, whether that's a story to a financier or to a local government or to a local community. And so how do you see that the way that you can tell stories to engage people across the process, and the kind of importance of that with some of these projects where you are trying to do something new or something that feels a little bit outside the box?
Yeah, I like to actually, that question has come up before, and I like to use the example of Bjarke's first office was named Plot.
Yeah.
Before Big.
With Dan from
Kobe. Dan was from Kobe was
Yeah.
there, Julian de Schmidt.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about the choice of name is that a plot can be a plot of land. At the time, you have to go back. We used to plot drawings.
Yeah.
And so you plot a drawing. But I think Bjarke and Julian also thought about the plot, the narrative. And if you start to like pull all those 3 things together, you have a site, you make some drawings and visions, and you tell the story and the narrative, that's what actually creates architecture. And I think that narrative and also emphasis on allowing people to come along for the ride, helping communities and municipalities envision the future, that's been something at the core of our process.
Yeah, because it's super important, isn't it? Not just to making projects happen, but I think as societies around the world, we've got some really big challenges, whether it's environmental challenges or housing or affordability or some of these other big themes at the moment. And people really respond well to good stories, don't they? That are emotive, that kind of tap into something that is maybe felt within a population. And so I think the role as an architect or as a developer, frankly, for that matter, is hugely around that. That's part of the reason why we have this platform, is to kind of allow people to tell stories and to share ideas in a way that isn't always easily captured or understood. So day to day, maybe on your big projects, whether it's a process or whether it's different to each project, but yeah, how do you really go about bringing people on that journey, telling those stories, and engaging in people to realize things that really are quite unique?
Yeah, I mean, I think initially you can begin with the story and the vision. Over time, though, it does become important that you can execute upon those visions and that you actually realize the full story or portions of the story. And so I think it's a combination of crafting those, but then also how do you actually execute? And I think that that's always the hardest part about what we do is, and this is where sort of NIMBYism comes in. There's so much resistance. There's so much friction, whether it's communities' perceptions about things, or whether it's the financial turmoils of ups and downs of the markets, whether a pandemic suddenly comes out of nowhere. There's a lot of friction in realizing the very sort of projects that we are a part of, and how to navigate that, how to, I always speak about sort of political time, that, you create something like the Big U. There was Mayor Bloomberg, and we started under his administration. We've now moved through 2 further administrations, and then we probably will have 2 to 3, future administrations to actually provide a vision for that then is executed. And how do those 4, 5, 6 administrations actually, how can they buy into that vision of a 10-mile long kind of flood management system? So I think you need different skill sets, and you need people who are very concerned and lovingly looking at the detail and the construction, and then others that can really navigate that planning kind of environment, and how to move with the different flows. So the Big U is a project I'm personally involved in. It's one that I've been there since its inception. I even was working in our office building when it flooded, and everything went black in Lower Manhattan. So I was personally affected, and therefore personally engaged and interested in trying to solve the issues that global warming and sea level rise are going to have, which affects every single coastline.
Yeah, no, I think it's an incredible project, that, and the way that you've managed to take something that is really pragmatic and infrastructural and critical. How do we stop Manhattan from flooding? You can get more critical than that, but you've managed to do it in a way that is very human, and is very much about kind of reframing everyday life to improve quality of life, you could say, through the spaces that you're creating, and that experience of daily life along the new infrastructure. So was that something very much intentional from the start, or and did you have to take people on that journey? Because I can imagine it would have been maybe sort of cheaper and easier to just say, well, we'll just build a wall, but it wouldn't have had any of the joy and the kind of longevity that comes from that. So did you find you had to kind of bring people along on that journey with you?
Well, the wall actually got built not in New York, but in New Orleans, which had Hurricane Katrina that flooded the 4th Ward, the 7th Ward, I think. And so the Corps of Engineers came into New Orleans and just built a wall, and the 9th Ward, and built a wall. And, you spent, again, billions of dollars. And now every single day, if you have a house, you're looking at that dumb gray wall, and it's only going to really perform its function, 0.0001% of the time that it's actually there. And we couldn't imagine that New York would allow that or would want that. So how could we build a wall that would prevent the city to flood? Because again, 200,000 people were homeless for extended periods of time after Sandy. And make that investment something that the people would enjoy and have use of every single day. And so this idea of the park and creating kind of a playful berm is what allowed us to navigate. Now, what the complexity of New York is that you have a lot of different landowners, both public and private, some with little snippets of coastline, others with, hundreds of yards of coastline. And so you have to bring everybody along. It's a collective decision. And that is in some ways a very un-American kind of approach where individualism and, I can do this is stronger. So I do think that it was a kind of European collaboration. So we had some Dutch water engineers, we have Dutch architects and planners ourselves from Denmark. So, we have hundreds and hundreds of islands and therefore a lot of coastline that we've worked with. And that together was able to help the New Yorkers find a way to navigate the NIMBYism against doing something collective. And now with the first parks actually opening up after a very long construction period, we're just seeing how the communities are engaging with a waterfront that for decades was just like cut off.
Yeah, no, I think it's amazing, and obviously, like what it will have done to the real estate and to the values and other things along that waterfront is compared to building a wall is obviously transformational. And so how do you see? Obviously, you're privileged to work in amazing places around the world and places like London, where I know working with Andy and the team here, you are working very much embedded in cities, in cultures, the planning system, the zoning system of that place. And then I imagine going to work in other parts of the world that maybe the Middle East or maybe parts of Asia or other places that have a real sort of drive and dynamism and are growing really fast. And so how do you see the kind of culturally working in those different places? Some of those things we've talked about today, and I'm sure there's kind of pros and cons of each environment, really.
Yeah, and actually, it's wonderful that you also name Andy Young, and in some ways the true leadership here in London, personified by Andreas, Andy, Henrietta, Alexandru, Lorenzo, Bodhi, they in so many ways reflect the kind of cultural dynamism, because Lorenzo is working on one of the largest and most complex projects in Milano called City Wave. You have Alexandru, who's designing these master plans in the Middle East on some projects that we have going in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. And then, Andreas is almost flying back and forth between the Emirates and London, working at a speed that is hardly possible in any other sort of jurisdiction. And then Andy is sort of entrenched in the planning processes along the Thames and on Fleet Street and, through other sort of areas of sort of historic London. So they do move at different speeds, and you have to sort of adapt. But the actual process and what is required is very similar. And so the adaptation is just in how quickly do you research, how quickly do you conceptualize. And what I often use is this idea of sort of measuring twice, cutting once, or measuring once, cutting twice. So even though things move faster in other locations, it actually means that some of the design decisions actually move into construction, and you're just making decisions later, and they may be more costly, right? Or they would be. And where you have actually a culture of more planning and making certain approvals earlier, you are measuring twice and cutting once. And so it really is just finding that balance in whatever environment and municipal kind of under what guidelines you're working in.
Mhm. Yeah, no, that's a really good analogy. And we were talking off mic, weren't we, about previous episode we've done with Pip Simpson from the Barbican,
Yeah.
and how that in the London context is this kind of exemplar of utopian planning from the 60s, and how that period in UK terms was just full of energy, full of optimism, and full of ambition and scale. Um, and then you move a few generations on, and you see those projects in light for good and for maybe some of the failings of those projects as well, like anything. So how do you as a business kind of see that kind of framing that optimism and the learnings from other places, and how does that then affect your work when you really are sort of designing cities or pieces of cities on the larger scale?
I think you used a really important word right there, framing. If one thinks of Barbican as a framework and that sort of adapts to the times, then any generation that comes through the Barbican can kind of remap, reprogram. It is that sort of flexible sort of space, and it's just very well proportioned. It has this lovely inside outside kind of quality. And any and every time I've gone there, I've just come away with that 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 I've had a great time, whether visiting a flat or going for a movie or a program. Um, and I think when one thinks about designing, then the idea that you can create sort of a flexible framework is also interesting. And the reasons that, warehouses, old warehouses, or old industrial buildings do so well is that they're sized for anything. And so you can, use a warehouse building with very large windows. You get ample daylight, and you can put in, a mezzanine or some floors, and it creates really, really interesting sort of lifestyles. That's kind of, I think, when we go into something, we design something that is, let's say, a portrait of the client and the brief. And we also consider what that, brief might be like in 50 years or 100 years, and what the futures are of that. So I like to think of it as just creating frameworks.
Mhm. Yeah, and then with those frameworks, you as a business, I'm sure you work with so many different varied client types, from
Yep.
likes of ourselves, who are kind of professional developers and regeneration companies, through to big corporates like Google, and I'm sure sort of
Nonprofit,
everything in between. Yeah,
affordable
exactly.
housing.
Yeah, exactly. And the full spectrum. You're probably very fortunate to work with probably one of the broadest spectrums of client types I would have thought out there. And so how do you see that, the role of the client, or the kind of the relationship between the architect and the client? And do you think are there any things that we can learn from how people client? Do any examples come to mind?
Well, I've now used portraiture as a means of describing the relationship, and I've also used midwife. Those are two very different kind of ends of the spectrum. I think that it's a little bit in part listening to what the client wants. And it's then using your experience, your skills to craft versions of that vision. And there are also clients who don't necessarily know what they want. And they come to you very honestly, sort of saying, the reason I'm here is because I need you to kind of help me visualize or formalize what it is. And so that's a little bit of detective work as well. But by working at many different ends of the spectrum, whether for-profit, nonprofit, whether a single person or a corporation, you need to bring it in a way down to a human level. And, even though there's Google, let's say, Google is still a relationship in a way between Larry, Paige, Bjarke, and Thomas. And the three of them met, I would say, a couple times a month, like face to face. And they would like discuss what it is that Google was to be. And when you asked the question of like, why two architects? Wasn't one enough? They went through a process of architectural selection where they had actually chosen three sort of individual architects before we were appointed with Thomas. And the way that I think Larry tells it is that when they were talking to the individual architects previously, the ego of the architect of here's what I would do for you came out too strongly, because the engineering side of Google is that when there is a challenge, you literally throw 10 engineers into a room and collectively they come up with a solution. And so in their world, they saw the power of the many versus the power of the one. And so they realized after 3 false starts that they wanted to try out the ability for 2 architects to work together. And that's, I think, again, we learned so much about ourselves in that process. And I think it's also benefited both Hedderwick and ourselves and just how we work, both internally and collaborate with one another and others. And I don't want to miss out on BDP also working on the King's Cross, or Adamson also working on Mountain View. So there's a lot of voices. And I think that is a lesson too for us, because so often we're just talking about one vision, right, being created. But it's so often a kind of collective that you have to navigate.
Mhm. Yeah, no, absolutely. And that sort of a range of voices involved in the projects, something that we're really passionate about and keen on, is trying to continually broaden that out more and more from, as you mentioned, whether it's different design voices or whether it's the broader design team or whether it's sociologists, anthropologists,
Yep.
And then out to members of the community, members of the business community. And we think over time, with that as a kind of a mission, we think, through the use of technology and use of communication and in person as well as digital, we can hopefully get more and more voices into the process of development and make it more and more interesting as a result. So I don't know if you've got any good examples, other examples from where those voices have kind of come in and maybe influence what you've done or the project in a positive way, from maybe outside the traditional built environment voices.
Yeah, I mean, I would maybe answer that in that coming to London and opening up the office here is, of course, you are entering also a whole sort of society of designers, architects that are contributing, both those who have contributed historically and you're looking at the buildings and interacting with them, but also contemporaries like I'm thinking of Joe Morris, Phil Kofi, Alison Brooks. I think that it's a continual kind of informing of one another, and the work that you see happening also inspires and starts to affect your own. And then, again, that's why I think that there's this incredible adaptation of that the big here in London um, is in some ways different than big in New York or big in Copenhagen. There are elements and kind of a DNA that is the same, but it is also adaptive. And that's where I think the local community of designers, the regulatory kind of environment has a big influence on the work.
Yeah. And are you doing any projects that are kind of co-designed with local groups or with I guess maybe like the Big U would be a good example of that. I'm sure there was a huge amount of kind of stakeholder engagement that
Yeah.
went into that with local people, local groups.
Absolutely. So, it is it takes a village type of project. So in the case of the Big U, we're talking about probably 20 plus collaborators, from a hydrologist, engineer, to ecologist that's looking at the kind of the ecosystem that is just under the water or up on the wetlands. It had to be translated into about 5 languages while the meeting was happening in real time. Plus, there were people on radios and television sets that were tuning in to the meeting as well. So this is of course New York. So you have this as the project moves through like the Lower East Side and Chinatown and into financial district, you're touching a lot of different perspectives, and they have different needs and wants. So by engaging linguistically and generationally, you're feeding that back into the project.
Hmm.
So there's so much engagement. Another project that is of that that grew out of public engagement is the Super Keelan project in Copenhagen, where I would say we were less architects and designers and more like curators of public participation. And the public presented objects like furniture, landscape, and bus stops and so forth. So by them coming up with all of these different suggestions, we were more like just placing them within the site and finding the right way of using all of the suggestions that were coming up. And I think being able to adapt to those different ways of being an architect. Sometimes you're just a meeting facilitator, and you're just listening, and then you're prioritizing maybe the brief for the city, of all of those different needs. Other times you are that curator, and at other times you are the voice of a specific vision.
Yeah, no, amazing. And like, kind of maybe sort of stepping back from this, then for you personally, kind of, committing your time to this work. What kind of gets you out of bed in the morning? Why do you enjoy doing what you do so much?
That no 2 days are the same, and it's been with Big now close to 20 years, and I have never had a day that started or ended the same. And it's a real privilege to be sort of it's a lot of hard work, and then the outcome of that is something that's quite tangible, which is that people want to engage. People also seek that engagement or seek you out, and then it's finding ways to to use design thinking in the most productive way. And architecture encapsulates, archaeology, history, sociology, and the arts, and that ability to sort of really cross a large part of human thinking is what makes, I think, architecture such an incredible choice.
Awesome. Kai, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I'm sure everyone's really enjoyed it. Thank you for being our number 50.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you for listening to the Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.